Hello, I'm Mark Norman, folklorist and author, and welcome back to another episode of the Folklore Podcast. I'm fresh back from my time at the UK Ghost Story Festival in Derby, where I've managed to record some extra content with a few little interviews with authors and other people who were attending the event. And I've also scheduled some longer interviews, which I'll do online with some of the attendees too. More of that soon. In the meantime, no big long rambling introduction to this episode because this really is a chonky, deep dive discussion into today's topic. The classic children's folkloric The Box of Delights. The staple of many a Christmas, although we are just past Christmas now. The Box of Delights needs no introduction for many, but for those who do need an introduction, you'll certainly get it at the start of this discussion. I was joined recently by three very special guests to discuss this topic, and the introductions will be coming up at the start of this panel. Welcome, everybody, to this discussion panel. Not often we have a discussion panel on the Folklore Podcast, normally an individual interview, but this definitely warrants a discussion, I think, because there is so much to go through. So you are all very welcome. I'm going to ask you first to start off by introducing yourselves, telling everybody a little bit about who you are and your background, and also, importantly, what your role is in the grand overarching discussion that is the Box of Delights. And Phil, we'll start with you.
So I'm Phil Errington, and I suppose that for the last 30 plus years, I've been doing work on John Masefield, that sort of academic work, which led to a PhD in bibliography. But of course, it all started for me with the Box of Delights. I've been lucky enough to have produced the two editions, which are currently in print, Midnight Folk and Box of Delights, the two Kay Harker stories, going back to the original manuscripts. And I'm also author of the book opening the Box of Delights, which is which looks at the background behind the writing and the adaptations, etc.
And indeed, that book is sitting next to me on my desk, and we will talk about that a little bit more later on too.
There we go. Look, there we are.
So everybody is waving copies of Opening the Box of Delights at me as we speak. Thank you, Phil. Piers, what about you?
Hello, my name is PIERS TORDAY, and I'm a children's author and playwright. And my role in Box of Delights goes back, like many of us, I suspect, to discovering it first through the brilliant BBC TV series in 1984, and then through that discovering the book. And it's probably one of the, the Narnia series or Tolkien. It's part of a foundational text of my imagination, I guess. Played an outsized role in how I think about stories. And I tried to turn it into a play at university with friends, but we couldn't because Mike Nichols, the film director, had the rights. And then by some weird miracle, perhaps directed by Masefield, not directed by Masefield, but in some kind of spooky Masefield coincidence, one of those friends ended up later running Wilton's Music Hall in the East End of London. And I was then writing children's books. And she said, "Do you want to revisit Box of Delights?" And I couldn't believe it. And we did. And we did it there twice. The first stage show ever of the play, of the book. And then we did it a couple of years ago at the RSC in Stratford. And the adaptation has been done pretty much somewhere every year since we first did it in 2016. It was most recently done in St Albans. So that's my involvement. And I got to know Phil very well through the development of that show.
Fantastic. And we will return to the subject of adaptation later on as well, of course. And finally, Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself too.
I'm Chris Chapman, and I was lucky enough to get to produce and direct a big documentary, feature-length documentary all about the Box of Delights called Time and Tide that came out with the BBC BluRay, which I managed to convince the BBC to make. When was it? It's like November 24 it came out. So I guess it's kind of a year and a few months ago, and basically that was like the most. It's kind of a dream gig, really. I'd watched Box of Delights on telly repeatedly on a VHS that my parents had taped off the telly. I think they taped it when it was repeated, I think in 87, when it was combined into kind of hour long or just below an hour episodes. So when I watch it now and it's in its originally transmitted form, I always get thrown by when the cliffhangers come in. I'm like, no, that's not right. And tried to convince the BBC they should release both versions on the set, and they said, "There's not enough room. Stop being a nerd." But that was what I really wanted. And basically, I've been working for the last 10, 15 years making lots of Doctor Who documentaries for the BBC as special features for DVD and Blu-ray, and just said, "Look, you've got to do that for Box because." It's not only is it great, and it's not just nostalgia. It is a program that when you go back to it, you go, "Oh, I had nostalgia for this," but it's also really good, and it's also a real achievement technically. And I think in terms of what, say, Rennie Rye does as a director and what the cast do. So to get to make basically, I think a 1 hour, 40-minute doc, just reuniting the cast and crew, going on location, trying to get everybody, almost getting everybody, getting pretty damn close to getting everybody, was just a dream gig for me.
1 hour 43. I rewatched it over the weekend. It is a fantastic documentary. And we'll certainly return to that and the TV adaptation later as well. I think a lot of people were celebrating you, Chris, this Christmas because the BBC we were talking about this earlier before we started recording, having added Box to iPlayer for last Christmas for the anniversary on what is generally a 12-month rights license for these things. It, of course, disappeared from iPlayer just before Christmas Eve this year. And social media was full of a lot of grumpy people.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I'm. It's not just me saying this as a salesman, but I think physical media is amazing, and I'm still very much one of those '80s kids that saw adverts that said, "Kind of own it forever" on VHS, and I still believe that if you really love something, then get it and keep it on your shelf, and then no streamer can change contracts or decide to make it limited. So I'm still a great believer that once you got it, you got it.
And you can only get the documentary on the Blu-ray and DVD. You could never get it streamed. So that's a sales pitch for the Chris's fantastic documentary.
Yeah,
yeah. No, and I did have a few people asking if they're going to broadcast it, and I thought actually the thing is, I just tend to be happy these things exist, and I think it's such a doc made for people who love this already. You know, it's not trying to make a case for why you should give a shit. It's like, you love this, so let's go deep. And you know, that I think that kind of approach often works better on physical media than it does on telly, where you have to justify why. So why is this a big deal? Why should I care? Actually, I'd rather jump ahead of that question as soon as possible.
Yeah, I completely agree. Before we go much further, we should probably summarize Box of Delights as a story, because in the UK there are probably kind of 3 people who are not aware of it over a particular age, at least. Globally, which this audience is, there are perhaps people who are less familiar with Box. We'll come to Masefield later on, but who wants to have a stab at laying out the plot of Box of Delights and what we're talking about here?
Piers, I think this is for you, really.
Good movement of.
As a man who's adapted it, I think this is your gig.
Challenge accepted, but please pick me up if I, because remember, the book is very different to the adaptation, certainly to the play, because there's lots that happens in the book that isn't in my consciousness as much as the stuff happens on stage. And just to say, Mark, it's interesting what you say about Box, because, and I think Phil and I have chatted about this before, it's very surreal. My experience of Box of Delights has either been that you know it and you're slightly obsessed by it or very obsessed by it, or you've just never heard of it. I have come across very few people who know it and are like, meh, like it's either not featured for whatever reason in their cultural consciousness, or they know it, and even if they're not as obsessed by it as some of us are, they totally get the levels of love for it. So it's very special in that way. And the story, for those who don't know it, who are listening to this, is it's one of those unusual things where the sequel has actually achieved far more renown than the original. And it's a sequel by John Masefield, primarily known as a poet, British poet laureate, who was born in the end of the Victorian era, and whose last major poem, I think, Phil, is about the assassination of JFK. So really spans an incredible era, and knew Yeats and knew all sorts of people, had an incredible life. Um, and he wrote a children's book called Midnight Folk in the 1920s. I can't remember the date, which introduced us to this character, Kay Harker, sort of young schoolboy, and a villainous fellow called Abner Brown. And it's a sort of treasure hunt. And there's a witch called Sylvia Pouncer, and there's black cats and all sorts of nautical goings-ons and wonderful adventures. And then in 1935, he writes this very different book, but it is a sequel featuring some of the same characters, but it's not a sequel perhaps in the way we understand sequels. It's more like in the same series, as it doesn't directly carry on a story. It resets some things. Certain characters appear not to know each other or have forgotten that they know each other. And it features this schoolboy, however, Kay Harker, who's returning home from the holidays on a train from school where he's been sent away. His parents are no longer with us. And he encounters this strange old man on this train who entreats him to keep this box safe because, quote, the wolves are running. And we don't know what this means or what the wolves are. He's also encountered some slightly curious clergymen, sort of tricksters who remind us of the fox and the cat and the Pinocchio stories and other things. And he goes home to Seekings, this big sort of Tudor manor house where he lives with his guardian, and some children who he's not related to, but he's very close to, who are staying for the holidays, not because they've lost their parents, but because their parents are on colonial duty in India. And essentially the story is the story of how Kay Harker has to keep this box, the box of delights, that's been given to him by this old man called Cole Hawlings, who appears to be a circus showman, keep it safe from some wolves who are led by Abner Brown, who's posing as a clergyman in the nearby kind of seminary where he appears to be training young clergymen to do holy works, but nothing of the sort. He's training them to do jewelry heists and to sort of scrobble, in Masefield word, or sort of kidnap local figures, because he's trying desperately to get hold of this box, because this box has many magical powers. It can make you go small as a mouse if you press one button. If you turn it the other way, it can make you go swift as a falcon and fly through the air. And you can also travel through time and space and sort of go back in time. And the story really is, in a sense, it is a bit like a folktale in the sense it's very kind of elastic and fluid, and we kind of leap from little episode to episode. It doesn't follow a sort of Hollywood 3-act structure. And Kay Hark essentially has lots of little adventures with his friends, try and keep this box safe. And he does indeed go as small as a mouse at certain points. And he travels back in time to Troy, to ancient Rome, to King Arthur's time. And all the while, though, there's this sense of these wolves, the forces, the fundamental forces of darkness and evil, led by Abner Brown, trying to get this box off him. And sometimes the battles are quite scary with wolves at King Arthur's camp. Sometimes they're quite comic. He goes back in time and meets an eccentric chap called Arnold of Tody. And in the present day, Abner Brown is in Kay Harker's time is sort of kidnapping people, and he tries to get Gull Hallings, who escapes by walking through a painting. And in the end, pretty much Abner Brown has almost scrobbled nearly everyone related to Kay Harker, and is holding them in this sort of prison beneath this seminary. And Kay Harker manages to get the box back, and with assistance from some flying rats, consign Abner Brown to a watery doom in the sluice, the kind of the kind of sluice operating the river beneath the seminary, and the Box of Delights is saved from the forces of evil. And along the way, he's also enlisted the help of Herne the Hunter, figure first introduced to us, of course, by Shakespeare in Merry Wives of Windsor, and who appears in various other tales and stories, and will appear later in the Dark is Rising sequence by Susan Cooper. And Alan Garner also references Herne the Hunter and Diana Wynne Jones. And it's a sort of magical story. And what I've completely omitted to say is crucially when this story is set, which is set at Christmas, because one of the main set of people Abner Brown is scrobbling is the clergy and the bishop of the local church. And what I love about the story is it all seems to take place really when the days are short and the shadows are long, and people should be sitting by the fire, sort of listening to reading books and eating crumpets in the kind of 1930s world that it's set in. But repeatedly, this warm kind of cozy world of Seeking's house, where the children should be having a nice Christmas, just doing that. The kind of shadows from outside, both from our own time and from deep historical time, keep coming in and disrupting. And I think as a children's story, I'm always struck constantly how children's stories in their world of fantasy and imagination are tonally only a few steps away really from horror or kind of folklore horror. And Midnight, the Box of Delights is a classic of those stories because of the humor, because of the eccentricity, because of the talking animals, because of the the kind of slightly ridiculous, kidnapping, scrobbling bishops in a car that turns into an aeroplane, and sort of gangsters with Tommy guns. There are things that make it feel like a safe adventure story, but there are also lots of things in it that make it feel like really quite a scary story about old forces of good and evil in this land of the UK and in our landscape and in our shared consciousness. And the way it manages to go between all those things is a kind of testament, I think, to John Masefield's genius, and one of the reasons I think why the story endures for so long, because it's so many things at the same time.
I think that is a perfect summary, Piers. Thank you. Now, for people watching this on YouTube, we will lose the audio people slightly at this point because this is a little more visual, and none of you know about this either. Obviously, the central element of the Box of Delights is the Box of Delights, which, as you say, holds such a lot of magical power for what is such a small object. And I thought to myself, well, how can we demonstrate what exactly we're talking about here? And then out of the blue, a colleague of mine on social media said, oh, I see that you're doing a discussion panel about the Box of Delights. I said, yes. He said, pop round and see me. So I went round to see him. This is a guy called Richard Burgess. I went to school with him. He's a very long-time friend. And he gave me this silver box, which I will try and hold up in front of... There we go. I'll move my microphone to one side. He gave me this silver box, which on the top says Ministry of Arcane Artifact Preservation. And I thought, okay. So it turns out that this is indeed what we're talking about here.
Wow.
Okay. So this is the Box of Delights. I'll just try and hold it.
Amazing.
I can't guarantee that it's quite as bright inside as the original, but... So what we're discussing here, this is the key to everything in this story. This is the Box of Delights. The little switch on the front is what you push to one side to go small, or what you push to the other side to go swift. So there we go. Testament to my friend's powers of making replica props. This is slightly larger, he assures me, than the original. Chris, you'll be able to say for definite because at the end of your documentary, Devin, who plays Kay Harker, produces said box, I think.
Yeah, that was a nice surprise actually, because I'd continuously asked people when we were speaking to Rennie and the rest of the crew, to Rennie Rye, the director, do we know what became of the box? And we knew that they'd had several boxes. There'd been a kind of hero box, the main one for all the juicy close-ups, but then there'd been a slightly different one which you could shine a light through the bottom of to illuminate Kay's face when he opens it, particularly in the bedroom. And we didn't know of any of them surviving. And then I think only about 2 days before we were going to have a weekend of Rennie and Devon back together, Devon texted me and said, "Oh, by the way, shall I bring the box?" Yeah, yes, you should. You should bring the box. And that was just the case that I think Devon had been unofficially given it at the end of the shoot, the hero, the main box. And he thought not much of it. And he's kind of a lovely, down to earth, a very kind of deadpan kind of guy, Devon. And so he wouldn't have, I don't think, seen the romance in the box surviving itself. But his mum did, and his mum kept it on her shelf for, I mean, it's 40 odd years now, isn't it? Over 40 years. And so he'd pop round to her house to get it off the shelf, bring it on the shoot. To my shock, on the first day of filming, I said, "Do you bring the box?" And he said, yeah, it's in my backpack. And he just had it loose in his backpack amongst t-shirts and pairs of jeans. Again, he wasn't attaching an awful lot of significance to it. But I'm so glad. I mean, the fact that it survived is the important thing. And so we could genuinely play like Rennie hadn't seen that box genuinely until Devon produced it on camera, and then what you see in the film is genuinely them geeking out over it, and that went back with Devon after the shoot. So I don't know where. I mean, I believe there were 2 other boxes that were made, as I say, for kind of alternative shots, that probably were slightly flimsier, may not have been done to the same degree of craft. But the hero box is still with Devon, with his family, which I think is gorgeous. And I was very sad to hear that Devon's mum, who features in the film, actually passed away just before Christmas. I spoke to Devon about that, and I think he was glad that she's in the film. We interviewed his mum to talk about it, and so I presume now the box is with Devon, and the box being with Kay Harker feels very apt after all these years.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite interesting that you've got a replica there, Mark. As a sense of how fond people are of this adaptation, there is a roaring trade I see on eBay for people who do make replica boxes, and indeed I think you can get Box of Delights earrings and all sorts of Christmas tree decorations, etc. So it's a big trade at Christmas. So yeah, I don't have a replica box, but the family have never picked up any of my hints. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly a thing, very much a thing.
I'm sure.
Sorry.
I was just going to say very quickly, I'm sure if we'd have been making the Blu-ray in the noughties, that it would have come in a commemorative box-shaped, kind of probably flimsy cardboard, falls apart by the second Christmas kind of box, but it would have been in. I'm sure it would have been like when they did Eccleston's first Doctor Who season, and it was in a kind of very box-shaped TARDIS that then fell apart. But I think if we were a bit earlier, so I feel like we missed out on that, sadly. But what were you saying, Piers?
I was just going to add that in the somewhere in the RSC store, there are several boxes because, of course, when we adapt it on stage, we had to think about So when Kay presses the button to go as small as a mouse, we used a puppet to show that. So of course you then needed to have a puppet box that was in ratio to the puppet size. And then we then had an adult box that was wirelessly controlled and could open of its own accord and let out huge beams of light. But then there are moments when the box gets lost. So we needed to have copies of that box that would be dropped in the sea in waves or whatever and got lost and retrieved. So there were, and of course because this was live stuff, the wretched thing kept, I mean, over several performances, wear and tear, it breaks, things stop working. So there were several, I don't know how many there are, but there are for real enthusiasts, there are multiple, some, box of delights. But what's fun is there is one that does open of its own accord via a remote control and shine a bright light, which is fun.
I feel that's what you need, Phil, to be fair.
I think so, yes.
So how did you all first come across Box of Delights? Piers, you alluded to the fact that obviously through the TV version first and then the book. Phil, I suspect for you it was slightly different. So what was your first kind of introduction to Box? But more importantly, what effect did it have on you at that point?
So for me, it was the book. And it was a couple of years or so before the BBC adaptation. And for some reason, well, precisely the reason, my mum was reading it as part of a book group. Their book group had decided to do children's books, and Box of Delights had been chosen as one of those books. She read it and instantly said, "You've got to read this. You will absolutely love it." The story from my mum is that she was waiting to go. I think she had a choir rehearsal, but she was sat in the car waiting for the time for the rehearsal to start, but was reading the end of Box of Delights. She completely missed the rehearsal. She forgot time. She forgot what she was doing, absolutely immersed in this. So she gave it to me and said, "You must read it." And of course, you should never tell a child, "You must read this." I resisted it for months, and then eventually, very grudgingly, picked it up. And I was just transported. It was this realism and magic. It was beautifully written. And I don't know what, the age I was, I'm surprised at how the language affected me. But yeah, I mean, the effect of it was that I was absolutely smitten with this book. Found The Midnight Folk and devoured that. It didn't have the same effect on me. As Piers has pointed out before, they're very, very different books, but still loved it. And then looked around for other works by John Masefield. And that's really where the rest of my life took a bit of an odd direction. My dad knew of a secondhand bookshop, and I went into that secondhand bookshop and said I was after works by John Masefield, and the owner's eyes just lit up. He knew he was going to get this much of his shop back, because he had shelves of sort of Masefield that nobody had asked for years. And that's where it all started. And funnily enough, I now work for a rare book dealer, Peter Harrington, and rare books are my business. And actually, it probably started with this whole desire to get works by John Masefield simply out of print, forgotten, nobody wanted to know. And I think that's another side of this for me, that I feel that everyone knows Box of Delights, but very few people know anything about Masefield, and that he's grossly undervalued.
I did a talk for Peter Harrington a couple of years ago. It was an online talk, but I was in London at the time, so I did it from the basement of their shop. That's a shop you could spend some time in.
One of three shops.
Well, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, we've got Scotland Road, we've got Dover Street, and we've also opened in New York. So yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating and brilliant place to work, and you are surrounded with rare books and amazing material on a daily basis. It really is a magical place to work.
Yeah, I think there was a diary signed by Livingstone in a glass cabinet when I was there. Yeah, just to give a flavour of the kind of books.
Just to give a flavour of what we've got. Yes, I mean, we've seen a number of first folios of Shakespeare in the last few years. It's a wonderful place. Yeah,
absolutely. Chris, what about you? Where did you first come across Box?
Well, it was on taped off the telly VHS, and I think it must have been something that really appealed to my mum and dad. I was born in 81, so I may well have been sat down to watch it in 84, but I have no I can't be honest and say I've got a memory of that. But I think because my dad was an author of history books about railways from the kind of steam engine era, I think that side of the production, particularly that first episode, on the Severn Valley Railway, I think that would have appealed very directly to him. And my mum was always more kind of almost kind of countryside-y, kind of there's something quite oldie worldy Green Man, I think, about the way that my mum saw the British countryside and grown up in Suffolk, going out and painting creatures and painting wildlife and plants and flowers. And I think there's some kind of intersection there in the Box of Delights between this almost kind of pagan view of, like, ever since pagan times, this sense of what Britain is, mixed with that bit of industry from the early 20th century that my dad was obsessed with. So I think they both plonked me down in front of it and then taped it themselves to show back to me. And I just used to watch it all the time. Like, we had Mary Poppins and Box of Delights, and there was an 80s version of Swallows and Amazons that Andrew Morgan, the director, did, which is very good. And but Box was the one I just watched over and over, and particularly that, I think, for a lot of people, that first episode and the encounter with Cole Hawlins in Ep 1 and with Charles and Joe. I mean, the Charles and Joe scene on the train, I think, is just the definition of stranger danger. And so from the very beginning, you've got the sense that, unlike the Enid Blyton that I was very much enjoying in book form at the time, I never thought that Julian and Dick and Anne and George would actually get killed by the smugglers. It never felt like there was a real danger and jeopardy. And I do feel that when Cole takes Kay in close at the station, and as Pierce says, there's the wolves are running. Partly it's the words, and it's the direction, and it's the performance. You really feel like it's a child being dragged into a very grown-up, adult, dangerous world. And I think as a kid, you're like, this is great. I'm not being talked down to. This is a story where children can be heroes, and, like the Spielberg movies we were watching growing up as kids, but there's a darkness there, which I think I became a Doctor Who fan, but I loved Box before I loved Doctor Who. And just like Doctor Who, it's almost like I think an access, it's a gateway into horror and into that genre of hauntings and horrible mysteries. So I used to love it, and I'd watch it all the way through. And I think as a student, I bought the DVD thinking I was buying a lot of retro shows at that time, and I was going back and watching episodes of cartoons from the 80s like Mask and Thundercats and all sorts, like a Starfleet, the puppet show that used to be on ITV on a Saturday morning. And I was going back to them all with this kind of highfalutin idea of what I thought they were, and having to modulate that with the reality of, oh, it's this, it's not bad, but it's this. And with Box, I went back and just thought, this is great, and I love that those scenes at the beginning on the train are shot for real, that it's not people in a studio with a janky background or CSO lines around, fringing around heads. It's for real, and I loved it just as much. And since that point, I have a daughter, Edie, who's 7 years old now, and I introduced her to Box on telly when she was about 4, and I try not to brainwash her too much. I guess every parent brainwashes their kid initially a bit, don't they? But she loves it, and will ask me to put it on at Christmas now. And I hadn't read the book for whatever reason. I think I had the Midnight Folk as a book, and it was the version with the artistic impression of Devon on the front, kind of sitting at the base of a tree, surrounded by animals. So I'd read that, but I'd never read the Book of Box for whatever reason. And only when Edie came on the scene, I read her the book for the first time, having watched the show together. And the book is such a rich, it's such a rich beast. There's so much imagination in there, and I loved it. But I also thought, what we never really got a chance to sing the praises of in the documentary is the work of Alan Seymour. That the adaptation of the book is so shrewd, is so good at taking actually what is the guts of this story, and it's the stuff that we can actually create on a TV, admittedly big £1 million TV budget, but actually saying what is the core of this story. And I think we don't talk enough about how clever an adaptation that is. So I've enjoyed it in all its forms now, at least. But I'd love to see it. I would have loved it if Mike Nichols had done the movie one. I think that would have been. I'm sure there will be an excellent movie made of it at some point. I'm sure.
But we will return to adaptation, and you'll be able to sing those praises some more in a short while. Piers, ironically, as a children's author for you, you are saying that you began with the TV version as well, and then retrospectively went to the book. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd never heard of it, but it was I was 10, and it was trailed, I guess, to my parents as a big, those Radio Times, the famous Radio Times, as a big treat for children. Obviously, they spent £1 million on it. It was a big deal, and lots of talk about obviously the groundbreaking special effects and things like that. And I think we were slightly wary because we had fallen in love with and then been so frustrated by the animated adaptation of Lord of the Rings that then stops abruptly halfway through. And although I didn't have familiarity with the original text, it was seen in the same kind of, this is an iconic book. And Bill, like Chris was saying, immediately that first episode is so gripping. I think it is, and I grew up in rural Northumberland. We'd really lived in the middle of nowhere. So it was very dark outside, no one around for miles. Definitely not a place to watch horror films. And as a 10-year-old child, that was definitely top level, kind of scary in the same way Doctor Who's and other things, or other adaptations like the Tripods and the Triffids were also like quite scary because, you kind of felt it, this thing beaming into your sitting room. But also I recognized it because, I'd read lots of classic English, had read other classic English adventure stories, and that meeting people on a train sort of fitted right in, but this did feel different. And I remember so clearly, so vividly, I think we did have VHS, but we were certainly not up to setting timers, and that all felt very complicated and unreliable. And we'd gone to some friends for tea at the end, whenever it was in December. And I was just, for the first time, nagging my mum to get back because we couldn't miss the final episode where Abner Brown, I hoped, was going to be dealt with. And that's generally my first memory of a story being so compelling that I was going to kind of disrupt a social, make myself unpopular and be told don't be so stupid. But somehow we did go back and we did see it. But it is dark, full of those weird Punch and Judy type images and the terrifying Robert Stevens as Abner Brown. And so much adult stuff that now, of course, makes a lot more sense, but was so mysterious and confusing. And the way the church that I'd always taken as, Anglican kind of, this is the bastion of normality, being kind of subverted and being made sinister again. It threw lots of norms, it basically took Christmas, that's meant to be a nice time of year, and made it into a scary time of year, as well as keeping the nice, and the church and all these kind of things, and people you should trust, you shouldn't trust. And so then after that, I went and discovered the book, and it is very different, but it's always, I think it's almost impossible to read the book without the TV imagery in your head if you've come that.
Let's jump on that idea of the church a minute and magic and all of these sorts of ideas, because I mean, this is obviously a hook for this podcast for something that my audience is certainly going to be very interested in generally. But the role of magic and the role of paganism in particular, and that kind of symbolism in Box, and as you say, the role of the church in subverting those ideas. Phil, this comes from John Masefield's background to a certain degree. I guess he had an uncomfortable relationship perhaps with the church. Is that fair to say? But the symbolism, the pagan symbolism, the old ways, the old religions that are so central to the plot of Box, where does that come from?
I think the point is that Masefield is grounded in a folklore history. He understands his background. He knew myths and legends. But he was a writer who's very keen on sort of living history. So there's a great one of the things which he's very passionate about was Roman Britain. And there's a great story that he was grubbing around on the top of a hill and said, "Oh, the Roman camp must have been about there." And someone said, "Well, it can't possibly have been there." And then a few years later, they started digging, and that's exactly where the Roman camp was. it's as if he had this other sight. There are various poems which relate to Roman Britain being part of the present, and sort of the country is marked by its history. The countryside is marked by the people who were in it or the actions that happened there. So there's that sense of the background with Masefield. There's a book he writes, early children's book that he wrote called A Book of Discoveries. It's not particularly readable. I wouldn't recommend it. But two boys are sort of taught not to be catapulting things and killing things by this landowner who takes them to parts of the countryside and explains the background, the history. And it's all about old medieval folklore, and Masefield is really deeply rooted in this idea. He's very, it goes back to his sailor beginnings, I guess. This is a man who goes on a school ship. That's his education is a school ship moored in the Mersey. He arrives late because he had, I think, chicken pox. He's not sure how he's going to fit in. He's very much the youngest boy. He gets on board a bit late, daunting. The one thing he finds practically on day one is that he can tell a story. And that is his opening, his admission into school life and acceptance. He can tell a story. But then he starts to adopt the whole idea of this great sea history, that sea mythology and everything else that he can add into it. So you've got a born storyteller who starts to understand that the background in which he's then thrown has this great folklore about it, this great store of stories about the sea. And it starts at the sea, then we get into the England of past years. It's a constant building on and gathering of fable and myth and legend. One thing that I found just the other day, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote Opening the Box of Delights, was I was continually finding little tidbits that seemed relevant to the writing of the book. And I hope you'll enjoy this bit. If I may read you a letter that he wrote in 1923. He writes this to a friend. I mean, this is an unpublished letter, and he describes that every Christmas a group of mummers come and play their play for him. And he says in this letter that hitherto they'd only had a certain type of mummers who'd done a debased version of the play of St. George. They came as usual this year and moved one much as before. When they'd gone about 20 minutes, the real miracle happened. A new team of mummers appeared, even more gorgeously dressed than the others and containing 2 extra characters. It was plain at once that they were acting a far purer version of the play. They restored all sorts of unintelligible words to meanings. At the end of the play, they brought in extra characters with a few lines which showed that the old play was a pagan festival connected with the sacrifice of a beast. Masefield then says that the person who acted it said that his grandfather had played this version of the play, but it hadn't been done for years. He said that he had always had the version written out by his grandfather in a desk, and the idea had come to him, get it up for my benefit. So he and the other men and the boy made up their elaborate costumes and rehearsed together, and then tramped 5 miles in a vile gale of snow uphill to act it before me. I don't think any honor I have had has touched me so deeply. It overwhelms me when I think of it. Now, what I find fascinating about that is that Masefield is obviously known in the local community as enjoying the performance of a group of mummers. Somebody else has an older version of the play. They get it up and take it and present it to Masefield. Now, all sorts of levels here, but I think the point is that the old play is connected to a pagan festival. Masefield absolutely gets that. But if we remember in Box of Delights, one of the things about coal haulings, one of the excuses why the clergymen are after coal haulings is because he has older versions of the Punch and Judy play. So this letter was written in 1923. This is a decade or so before he wrote Box of Delights. But it's that idea of versions, that idea of older things living in the memory that actually I think helps fuel the writing of the Box of Delights.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting to consider how this sits as well, I think, alongside other children's literature as well. I mean, there are obvious examples when we think about this kind of style of plot or of writing. Susan Cooper, Alan Garner, these sorts of things, obviously. And also more recently, I guess, and Piers, you'd be able to speak to this, I'm sure. There are lots of children's books or young adult books coming out now that play on these themes. We've seen a resurgence of interest in folklore more generally. There are lots of reasons for that. It's not unusual. It happens generationally, really. But there's a lot of children's literature at the moment playing on these ideas. I interviewed Darren Simpson about his book Thirst fairly recently, which is very folk horror, has a central theme around river sacrifice and these sorts of things. How does Box of Delights, the book, sit alongside other children's literature, and to what extent do you think it informs it or is informed by it, perhaps even in earlier iterations?
I think it is really interesting that it's written in the 1930s, and it's written by someone who's grew up in the end of the 19th century and has seen tremendous change, technological change, political change, obviously First World War, the Spanish flu, the Great Crash, and not, obviously, which all have echoes in our present day in different ways. And to me, it feels very much like someone who's writing for children. And if you look at some of the earlier books, sort of classic books for children like Wind in the Willows or The Jungle Book, I think they're very much books that are saying to children in the late Victorian Edwardian era, everything's going to be okay. This is, if you look at the riverbank, yes, it's full of animals, but don't worry, the ferrets and the weasels and the stoats will be kept in their place, and it's all going to be picnics. And I mean, there's more to the book than that, but picnics and sunshine forever. And in the Jungle Book, it's even saying the whole world, don't worry, the whole world will be colonial administrators will sort out the world in the form of sort of the way the animals are presented in that story. And Masefield's doing something very different. As you said, it's the first story that makes us feel things can be a bit scary. And he's saying, actually, hang on, things are changing a lot. So I'm going to give you a car that turns into a plane. I'm going to give you villains with machine guns, like a lot of other adventure stories at the time. But I'm also going to remind you that some of the psychic forces that power these changes have very, very deep roots. And that whilst on the surface, we may be living in a world of diamonds and skyscrapers and telephones and motor cars and mass-produced armaments, that's all the surface chatter. We also still live in a world of sort of deep feasts and rituals and those characters that he goes back to. And I'm absolutely convinced that him doing that makes it possible for C.S. Lewis to write the Narnia stories in a different. We know C.S. Lewis was a fan of Masefield and specifically the Box of Delights. Tolkien, it's less clear, but I'm still sure that it was part of Tolkien's consciousness in writing these other worlds. Again, Lord of the Rings.
If I could just jump in there on Tolkien, I don't have any evidence that Tolkien read Box of Delights, but they certainly knew each other. Tolkien at that point was based in Oxford and was the professor of Middle English, and Masefield was living, or had been living, not too far away on Boars Hill. One of the fun facts about Tolkien and Masefield, and this is a bizarre fact, and Piers, I've told you this before, is that Masefield was organising a festival in Oxford and decided that he needed the professor of Middle English to recite some Chaucer. So he invited Tolkien to read, I think it's the Reeve's Tale. And Tolkien said yes. I'll turn up and I will read the Reeves Tale in Middle English. And Masefield said, well, if you're going to do that, you better wear the right costume as well. So Masefield was responsible for Tolkien dressing up as Chaucer to recite the Reeves Tale. And I think that is the essential part of where we get the fun of Masefield coming out. That you're going to have an Oxford gathering where you're going to recite some Middle English. You're going to get the right person to do the job, but you're going to make him dress up and wear the appropriate costume. That's the fun of Masefield. Now, going back to where we were, did Tolkien read Box of Delights? I don't know, but they certainly knew each other.
It's so interesting, and I think it's so easy. Obviously, with hindsight, I think you can see that what Box of Delights does is it opens up the space to say, hang on, children's books that come out of nursery tales and all that kind of thing can actually be more ambitious. And so C.S. Lewis goes, actually, I'm going to write a children's series that's yes, obviously biblical Christian elements, but also equally inspired by the Fairy Queen and all sorts of other folk elements in there. I can do that. And Tolkien says, yeah, I can write a children's book that's based on Icelandic sagas. I can have a story that resonates to today's children. And I think that's what Susan Cooper does, and Alan Garner in a very different Alan Garnerish sort of way. And then later J.K. Rowling and Philip Pullman, that all trading on this idea that actually you can have metaphysical ideas, you can introduce different myths and folklore traditions and religions into work for children, but also somehow in your own way make it feel of the present day and contemporary. And he kind of starts that.
And I think you're right, Piers. The essential one thing we haven't really touched on, because we're not discussing it, but we're not discussing the Midnight Folk, which, as Piers had said, is the first book. But there is this shift. There's this massive shift between what is essentially a book set in the Victorian background. It's a treasure hunt. It's got talking animals, but it's a fantasy, of course. But then suddenly, 1927, Midnight Folk, 1935, Box of Delights. There's this massive shift. Piers is right. You use most of the same characters. Abner Brown is back. Sylvia Daisy Panther is back. Kay Harker, of course, is back. But there's been this massive shift in the way that Masefield tells the story. It's brought up to date. It has gangsters. It has machine guns, and it's brought up to date. But it's relying on this background of folklore, and I think that's the genius of this book. People debate the Kay Harker books and which is your favorite. The genius of this is that massive shift into the modern era, and bringing it up to date. This is the age of flying cars, and first flying car in literature. Forget Chitty Chitty Bang Bang or the Weasleys' Ford Anglia. This is it. But this is Masefield's inventiveness. There's this weird and wonderful sudden changing of gears for Box of Delights.
At the same time, magic, all of these sorts of things, fantasy, lots of that, and bringing it into the modern period. At the same time, there are still elements of history in here as well, and true history, not fictionalized history. Cole is Lully, for example. So speak a little bit about perhaps Cole as a character, but also the way that draws on historical happenings as well.
So another thing to bring in is the Masefield world. And I will always say this, that you can't quite appreciate Box of Delights until you know a little bit more about Masefield's work. The crucial one here is a long narrative poem called King Cole. And King Cole is all about a struggling circus, and nobody is coming to it, and they're going to have to close down. And suddenly the figure of King Cole arrives, this mythical stranger who transforms the fortunes of this circus. Now, for Masefield, the circus with sort of traveling players and their entire sort of background of tradition is a big thing. But the crucial thing here is that King Cole enters. Old King Cole was a merry old soul, and we know all of that. But he brings in this extra, this magical element that the English tradition is used to transform the rites, the transform the performance of this struggling circus. So in that respect, it's bringing in all sorts of background, and King Cole feeds directly, of course. King Cole becomes Cole Hallings. Masefield uses characters, uses names many times, and King Cole Hallings obviously goes back to King Cole and the nursery rhyme.
I'm going to move on in just a second to each of your separate projects that are really kind of involved with Box on different levels. So that's the adaptation for the stage, the documentary, and obviously your book, Phil, looking at all of these different aspects that we're discussing today. Before I do that, there's one other point really that I wanted to raise at this point, just to transition into adaptation perhaps as well, is I was thinking about one word to kind of sum up Box of Delights and all of these things that we're discussing. I tried to write down one word for that. And the word that I came up with was evocative, because I think that the story is evocative of so many different things. And there are lots of different aspects, both in the book and in the TV adaptation in particular. It'll be true for the stage as well, I'm sure. Of these things, these roles of magic and paganism and the church and Christmas and all of the tradition involved around that as well. I mean, obviously a key one for all of the adaptations, I guess, is Healy Hutchinson's Carol Symphony, which is used as the theme music for this. And I'm sure that a large percentage of the population now, if they hear that music, even if they're a classical music fan, the one thing that they're going to think of is the Box of Delights. And really the music is evocative of all of the things that are part of this story, aren't they? They're evocative of Christmas, obviously, but also underlying it, you get all of these senses of some kind of connection to the past and all of this as well. There's lots, isn't there? The landscape, the music in the adaptations, all of these things. Is that fair to give as a kind of sort of single word that summarizes a lot of this for everybody? Do you think it is just evocative of so much stuff? I think
you're right. It's a very good word. The one I would add in, different words for different aspects of it. I also find Box of Delights funny. I mean, it's a humorous book. It doesn't take itself seriously. It's written with an earnestness. It's written without talking down to children. Something that Chris has pointed out. But I think there's a lightness of touch about it all, that it doesn't become preachy. It doesn't become too heavy. It just is there. But one of the reasons is that Masefield has got, as I say, this lightness of touch, which is quite funny. And we've spoken about scrobbling and Abner Brown trying to scrobble the entire clergy. And on the one hand, it's very sinister, it's very dark, it's very threatening. And on the other hand, it's funny. Now, going on adaptations, PIERS brilliantly did this in his version. You see a stage full of people, and gradually their numbers decrease as bags are put over their head and they're taken away. It becomes quite amusing, and the audience are allowed a small time to laugh at it. But it's absolutely in keeping with the way that Masefield does it, that it's quite funny at the same stage as being threatening and worrying. So I think the humor in Masefield is underestimated.
I think in countenance to that, I think the word I come back to again and again is danger, and I think that there is something about that, the Healy Hutchins, about the way that those adaptations begin, something about the tone of that music that is both kind of it has that comforting element of kind of feels like snowfall or Christmas, but there's some glass in there, there's some ice in there that gets under your skin. That, as I say, a 7-year-old in my house, that's the thing that immediately got her to sit up. And you couple that in the TV version with the visuals and these kind of nightmarish portraits of the creatures and evil things you're going to encounter. I think Danger's interesting. What we were talking about with the roots for Masefield, I was curious that obviously 1935 is such an interesting time as well, in terms of the world stage. And it feels like when I think of a lot of the kind of imagery of Box, I equate it to what, say, like Hitchcock is doing in British cinema at the same time. And as obvious as things like, I know Strangers on the Train, I think, is later than 35, but you think of things like the 39 Steps, and I guess we're close um, to what's the one that ends on the Statue of Liberty? Is that Sabotage that ends on the Statue of Liberty? But there's something about the kind of the kind of 30s, what's happening in 30s cinema, and the idea of agents and undercover agents, people who seem like nice things like clergymen, but are actually awful and wicked. In films like The Lady Vanishes, the idea of kind of particularly what's happening in Germany, and the idea that there may be something that seems nice and respectful, but underneath it is something nasty. I think there's a lot of that feeding in that we find unnerving when I watch it back.
It's really interesting. I completely agree with that, and we toyed with the idea and we adapted it for the stage of being more explicit with that and setting the book in 1939. But actually, the problem is once you introduce the Nazi idea into stuff, it always completely overwhelms everything, and it would have spoiled that delicate balance between comedy and magic. And I think it's enough that it's like Box of Lights. It's all in layers, right? You can be a kid who watches it or reads it and just get it as an adventure story on its own terms. But if you, as an adult or any age in between, you can appreciate these different layers. But I completely agree with you that it sits of a piece with 39 Steps. The idea that people who used to be able to trust, a healthy Scottish crofter, someone offering to, these people are suddenly sort of sinister, and who can you trust? And I guess that captures the prevailing mood when political institutions felt weakened like they do now, and that the rule of justice and law was under threat. And there are so many sort of echoes, and I think Masefield's genius is that he knows not to kind of, for a children's book. There were obviously writers like Sapper doing that. They were doing big kind of explicit political adventure stories at the time, but he's doing something more subtle.
I think you're absolutely right. And the other interesting thing about it is the reception of the book. It's brought out in 1935, but it has a first edition. There are only 7,500 copies of it. It would have died a death. It didn't have the popularity of any of Masefield's other books at that time. It's only because the BBC did a radio adaptation, which was broadcast in 1942. And there again, that then hits the nerve. That hits it's broadcast during the blackout to evacuated children. That's where you get the connection, and that's when it starts to suddenly have a resonance, and people understand it and get this. Masefield is it there in the text? Yes, it is. But brilliant, beautiful timing that first BBC radio adaptation absolutely hits the nerve, and that nerve continues to be. I mean, the BBC radio adaptations are a massive thing, very, very successful, and that's why I think the BBC decided, look, let's put it on the small screen using the music. We've spoken about the Healy Hutchinson before. That music dates back to use in the radio series, and the story from Lady Stevens is that Robert Stevens said that he would only be in the BBC TV adaptation if they used that music. So you're absolutely right. There's that defining It's played on the harp, but it's got this eerie, icy, brittle quality about it, introducing menace right from the beginning. And we're going back to adaptations again with the with PIERS adaptation. There were little aspects of the Healy Hutchinson that were woven into the background music. You can't now separate Healy Hutchinson Carol Symphony from Box of Delights. You just cannot do it.
I think there would have been riots if we hadn't
There would
used
have been riots, yeah. Riots in Stratford. But beautifully done. And Chris is right. The brilliance of that opening sequence on television, very eerie, and you don't quite know what's going on. You see those skyscapes, that weird sort of stars aligning, and then it all focuses in, and you go into Cole Halling's eye. I mean, it's a bizarre thing, and it's a bizarre sequence, but it's incredibly well done, and still absolutely sort of arrests you today. And I could watch that opening sequence time and time again and still marvel just how brilliant it is.
It's also quite interesting who it's depicting, that it's presenting goodies and baddies in there, that you've got Hearn and Cole, you've got Abner and Rat and so on, but it's not making any distinction. Like, these are the goodies, these are the baddies. I know Cole has a slightly more benign expression, but it's not that benign.
It's interesting though.
In this kind of drippy kind of awfulness. And so again, you're like, who am I supposed to trust here? Who's on my side?
With your Doctor Who background, have you? I was quite struck rewatching some of the sort of Tom Baker days. That the opening sequence of Doctor Who, you always got the Doctor's face, absolutely. Doctor Who, you got the looks, and then the face of the Doctor hits you in the opening sequence. That's what they're doing here in Box of Delights.
I'm sure there must be a correlation, and also the fact that the Tom Baker face, famously, it is kind of slightly expressionless. It's not a big, we know Tom Baker for his big beaming grin, his big Cheshire cat, but he's not doing that in Doctor Who. He's looking slightly like he's not sure. It's kind of opaque, and you're like, I don't know, is this? And people talk about the Doctor Who title as being scary, even though it's also encouraging you on an adventure into time and space. So I think there is a connection. It's interesting what you're saying about Robert Stevens wanting the Healy Hutchins music, but it's also Edward Barnes, who was essentially kind of an exec. I think kind of Martin Stone as producer and Edward Barnes kind of as a kind of I think he's uncredited on the show, but he was kind of in the BBC Children's Department, head of department, I think, at the time. And him and Martin were very much, they'd grown up watching or listening to the radio adaptation. So Rennie comes onto the show very much with an edict, which is you must do what you, to an extent, do what you like, but you have to have this music. And that's echoed by Robert Stevens coming in. So the music is a real. It's quite rare, I guess, that like an unconnected piece is kind of adopted in such a complete way to a piece like this. It's very strange.
Lots of Doctor Who links here when you stop and think about it, I guess, as well. Patrick Troughton plays Cole, did play the Doctor after William Hartnell. You got Roger Lim from the Radiophonic Workshop, who does a lot of the scoring for the TV adaptation of Box of Delights. Plus, of course, it was groundbreaking at the time technologically as well. My background is in television production, so I graduated out of Ravensbourne at the end of the 80s, which is about 5 or 6 years, I guess, after Quantel Paintbox just began to become a thing. And I guess it was still in its infancy and almost being trialed at that stage, which is probably why the BBC could afford to use it so much for Box of Delights. But we have to remind ourselves, living as we do now in the 21st century with the kind of CGI and all of the effects that we have, that this was groundbreaking stuff at the time. So let's think about the TV adaptation for a minute then. And Chris, there's so much that we've covered already, and you mentioned Alan Seymour's adaptation of the book. There's so much else in there as well in terms of adaptation that's really crucial to make this work, isn't there?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's such a big book, and the Beeb. You look at the other things that the Children's Department were making around the same time, like not long afterwards, Martin Stone does The Children of Green Know, and that's very much like what you'd expect to see from children's drama. It's incredibly evocative and atmospheric, but it's like, let's base it around a stately house that we can, we can rent basically, and we can shoot in day and night. But really, something like Box, it's so much grander than, say, what was being done on Doctor Who. In that era, you look at, and John Nathan Turner on Doctor Who, the producer, would say he never had the budget that Box had, but it is of a scale that really not only the children's department had never seen before, but I don't think British Telly has really seen something on that scale. So it punches well above its weight. And my dad used to say to me when we'd watch it, he'd very proudly in the 80s say, and of course, son, they wouldn't have been able to do this unless technology had got to the stage it is now in the 80s, and obviously when we watch it now, there are some bits that stand up better than others, but I think that certain bits, when we look back at it, I remember looking back with Rennie on the sequence when Kay is small outside of I forget what it's called, outside of 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 um, of Abner's kind of baddie base of the big. I've gone mad. What's it called? The big
Missionary College.
Missionary College, Theological College, yeah.
college.
Chester.
Yes, there's the scene on the
Pope
steps.
under Chester's Missionary College.
Chester's, exactly. There's the scene outside on the steps where Kay is brushed with a broom by a clergyman, and I genuinely think that's a really well done sequence. I know it's not perfect, but I think there's subtlety to that, and the way that they've combined something on location with something in the studio, the way they've got the scale right. That's followed immediately by a bit when Kay goes swift as he's small, and a little miniature Kay goes on a little piece of string essentially, off it, and so immediately you get a moment which is, you feel for them having to achieve it, but it's not quite so successful. So there are bits, but the thing I love about the 80s one is that we think of it as a big effects extravaganza, and it is, but it knows that the power of doing something practically. So when you get to the end of the story and Abner is flooding his whole base, they're genuinely, Rennie's getting his cast to walk up to their waists in freezing cold canal water. That whole sequence with when Cole's hat turns into a boat and they try and go up the sluice gates, and then Abner falls into the water, is all for real. I mean, there's nothing in that sequence that is not really being done in water. You then get the contrast with the scene afterwards, which I think is probably one of the weaker visual scenes, where they're kind of up to their waist in polystyrene snow, and then are picked up by the old lady and Hearn in their sleighs, which I love. But you do have these shifts in things that have coped better over the years. But the work of Roger Lim, as you say, on, if you like, the kind of the electronic effects, and someone like Tony Harding, who's also a Doctor Who veteran, who's handling, I guess, the practical special effects, anything that explodes or has to be made to move in an unusual way, like the boat being pulled up the rapids over the sluice gate, is all Tony's work, and I think they do a terrific job.
I would encourage everybody to have a physical copy of the DVD or Blu-ray, if not just to watch Box of Delights, obviously, but to watch Time and Tide, because there is so much in this documentary, Chris, isn't there, that unlocks all of these things as well. There are great stories, yes, about blowing stuff up and taking half the building out with you when you do it and all of this kind of stuff. I'm not going to give too much away as to what's in there. But at the end of the day, all of these big effects, all of this big budget, the power, I think, remains in the storytelling, and the way that what is a big book is distilled down into those episodes without losing anything, isn't it? That's key to all of this.
Yeah,
I think that you can watch the series and go back to the book and find more in the book. That is brilliant. But then when you watch the series again, you don't necessarily miss those extra details. It's a beautiful adaptation, and absolutely right. Alan Seymour captured the essence of it and got the narrative working correctly. And actually, there's only one cliffhanger in the series that isn't a cliffhanger in the book, and this is when they're going down the weir in their miniature boat. That is made into a cliffhanger, and actually in the book it just says they were approaching the weir, but they managed it perfectly, or something along those lines. but it's it's dismissed, and that it becomes a big thing, certainly a very big thing for the adaptation. But the way that it is structured, when you look back at what's there in the book, it really has he did a brilliant job, as indeed did Piers for the stage adaptation. I mean, that there again, we're not talking there in half-hour chunks. We're talking about distilling the nuts and bolts of it. But if I may say so, we should talk about the adaptation, because the latest version for Stratford had a piece at the beginning and a piece at the end, which was new for Stratford and set it in some sort of context. And I think it suddenly represented it for a modern audience by setting a framework. Piers, do you want to tell us about what you did with that beginning as old Kay and his grandson go up into the attic?
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps alongside that as well, I think it's worth speaking to the fact that this is a major book and a major adaptation for the TV, as we've already seen. How do you look at a proscenium arch and an empty stage and go, right, this is how we're going to do this?
I mean, I think I'm just reflecting on what Chris is saying about the TV, in the sense that, yes, it had an unrivaled budget for the time, state-of-the-art special effects, and all sorts of things fell into place, the right people available at the right time, and were able to draw on the heritage of the radio, using the Healy Hutchinson music. And I think that's where we were lucky also. But what made the TV ultimately was the story, was the ability to bring out the story and the elements of the story, like for all the snow and people being shrunk into cartoons and all that. It was the story, and that's what we had with the stage. And I think as an adapter, your job is to just try and tell the story. And when we first did it for the Irish series in Wilton Music Hall, which is a wonderfully atmospheric space, and that was really important actually, because I don't think we'd have had the success we'd had if we'd just done it in a black box contemporary theatre first off. The music hall, the oldest music hall in Britain, already has that Masefield like folkloric history in the bones of it. You didn't need to do that much. But there are no wings, there's no fly tower, there are some traps, but very limited understage space. And we had a tiny, we had a cast of 7 and a sort of more than a fringe show budget, but definitely not a West End or RC budget. And my script was like, a car flies across the stage, a man walks through a painting, the stage is flooded and Abner is swept to his doom. And in the early production meetings, the designer and the director were just like, have you lost your mind? And I was like, look, my job is to tell the story. Your job is to then interpret it. And we discovered that actually the language of theatre was our friend. And we did use some state-of-the-art theatre. We nearly killed the power supply at Wilton's by getting in incredible servers to do video projections so we could have a phoenix rising out of the box of delights at the drop of dew, and it seemed to fly across the auditorium. But then the car was obviously, we couldn't do a chitty chitty bang bang hydraulic car. I mean, we just couldn't. So we had a sort of a model car on a stick. And so we used that language of theatre, whereas if you say, believe this is a flying car, and it kind of worked. And we had puppets and we had mime, and we used every theatrical sort of tool available to us. And then when we went to the RSC, it wasn't like this dual box production in a music box. It was in one of the country's top stages with every possible resource known to man, a much bigger stage. There's really nothing you can't do on the main stage at Stratford, which has its own challenges. But the brief from them was, we love this, we love the story, we love everything, they all got it. But, we will be having an audience who maybe aren't as familiar with this book and this story. So the challenge was, can you kind of dovetail it with a kind of a set piece? And as a kid, I always loved, I loved the Princess Bride thing, really, which is the dad reading the book and, in bed, and suddenly you're in the story of Princess Bride, or so many other versions of that, the never-ending story. I love things where it starts somewhere and then you're kind of going into the story. Because actually Box of Delights doesn't have that. It's very much all set in one. I know they go back in time, but it's in terms of a narrative, it's very much set in that one continuum. And so we just had this idea of a young contemporary case, slightly unspecified, but he's sort of grieving, and he's staying with his granddad, and it's sort of, the idea came from the designer Tom Piper, which was always this idea that the whole story could sort of be set in the attic at Sea Kings, that all the things in the story, the box, the train on which the things happens, the puppet rats, the dog, Cole Hollings' dog, Cole Hollings' puppet show, the picture, all these kind of key totemic objects of the Box of Delights mythology are all things you could find in someone's attic or loft, kind of abandoned and dusty and neglected. And in a way, in 2023, although the Box of Delights lore and the fan base was alive, absolutely, that book and that thing were of a very long time ago. So it was a way of sort of bringing it back. And then at the end, the Phoenix returns, and there's a moment of memory and grief at the end that kind of brings those two things together. Because actually, going back to that one word thing that everyone was talking about, evocative and danger. And what was yours, Phil? What was your...
Well, I said it was funny. I mean,
funny and all those things, but I also think actually a weird word I would apply is I do think there's a sense of grief about it. Running through the book, there's a just not sort of overwhelming personal grief. I mean more a reflective grief for things we've lost, which is a kind of natural thing, whether it's historical figures, but the power of stories. So that was something we kind of brought into it, as well as the comedy, as well as the danger, as well as the theatrical kind of fun of it.
It's a great theatrical technique, that too, isn't it? It brought to mind when you were saying about how much could be contained in an attic, like Stephen Malatrat's adaptation of The Woman in Black, and the way that story is told, and how so much can be contained in a wicker basket. Essentially, it's a powerful technique.
And I think Masefield wrote several plays, some excellent plays. He had a theatre at the bottom of his garden. We've heard Phil's story about him getting the mummers to do that special staging for him. And I think we're lucky in the sense that Box of Delights, and I get Alan Seymour also, I think, benefited from this, and the radio adapters, is that it's because it's episodic, and it's quite set piecey. So it is quite theatrical, and there's lots of encounters that are quite driven. I mean, the Charles Joe encounter on the train does have echoes or pre-echoes of Strangers on a Train. In other words, the little dramatic encounters, sort of dialogue driven, that are sort of lend themselves to adaptation. Whereas obviously what's more challenging are the action pieces, because big action sequences on stage are just challenging because of it. You don't have quite enough room, and you have to kind of cut to things rather than do the whole thing. But I think we found a way around that.
It's really interesting. We've all come up with a word. Those words have been very different and have drawn out different aspects of the story, which I find fascinating, because and it just really shows the power of this story, that all of these different aspects can come out. I'm mindful of the time. I know we've spoken for 90 minutes now about this, which again is testament to the power of this story. But we can't finish without discussing your book as well, Phil, because that was the springboard for this whole discussion at the end of the day. So Opening the Box of Delights, it does the same kind of thing that Chris's excellent documentary does for the Blu-ray, but looks obviously as well at Masefield as the author and all of the background behind that. Tell us a little bit, just to wrap up, about how that project came about and just how much work was involved in going into the archives and pulling out all of this material.
So, as I said earlier on, I've been working on Masefield for years and looking at archival collections, particularly his correspondence. And every time I looked in archives or read letters, there'd be little resonances or little things which occurred to me. Oh, that relates to the Box of Delights, or that relates to the Box of Delights. The point is, there's such a good fan base that I hoped that other people might be interested So I looked at Masefield's life. I then went on to the writing behind the book, the little things that from his life that he adds in there. I looked at the adaptations. I looked at a few of the historical background points about it. There was a lot of material there that kept coming up. So I thought, well, let's write if you like, a biography of the book. And very fortunate in that there is a wonderful group of people on Facebook, the Box of Delights Appreciation Society, and they have absolutely taken this to heart. And the book has been a surprising success. It's pleased me. It's pleased the publishers. But it's wonderful to see that a lot of people said, "Oh, look, this is the book that we'd like to have come out and be available in 1984," and it wasn't. The BBC didn't really do that sort of celebration of what they had. And I think as time has gone on, there's far more to say about Masefield and far more to find out about him. And as it relates to the book, Box of Delights, I thought, well, I'll put it in opening the Box of Delights. I must say it's got a wonderful foreword by PIERS. Thank you very much. It deals with the radio adaptations, the TV adaptations, theatre adaptation. I suspect I need to update it in order to talk about Chris's documentary. But it also includes the second and now third edition. It also includes the script of episode 1. So Alan Seymour's original script is in the back of it. So that's a nice little appendix at the back. And again, it's just one of the lovely reading scripts, but TV scripts are particularly interesting here in that there are things that Alan Seymour asks to do, and you know how it was achieved on the screen. I love looking at what was actually in the BBC script and how people had to interpret that and render it on the screen. That for me is a really fascinating bit of detail.
And hopefully this discussion will also please the publishers who, at the end of the day, sent me a copy of the book and suggested that I cover this topic. And that has been the springboard to bring all of us together today. And it's been an absolute privilege to be able to link together all of these things, Masefield, your exploration of the book, Phil, in your writing, Chris, your documentary, and look at the TV adaptation, which has so much rich detail in it, and PIERS, your knowledge of the stage and the way that you can adapt for that, and your background to it too. I think this has been a really rich and valuable discussion, and I hope that everybody who's watching or listening to it finds the same thing too. So finally, just to wrap up, this is your platform, all of you, for half a minute each or whatever, to be able to tell us what you're working on at the moment, what you would like people to go and seek out, and all of those things that allow me to promote what you are doing. Chris, let's start with you.
Well, people can explore as they wish, but this is still on the shelves. I'm holding up a copy of the Box of Delights Blu-ray. I'd recommend Blu-ray over DVD because it's better. And if you haven't got a Blu-ray player, buy a Blu-ray player because they can't take it away from you. Hooray! And since then, we did a big box set of the BBC Chronicles of Narnia that came out in November, where we kind of very much built on what we'd done with Box. And I did a even longer, it was like 2 hours, 10-minute doc called Return to Narnia on that, which is very much in the same kind of guise as the one we did for Box. And was a lot of fun to work on. And we're now working on Doctor Who stuff, Blake Seven stuff, and pitching perhaps some more BBC Family classics, which we might hear about further down the line.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. PIERS.
Well, I've just had a book out called Tree Thing, which you can maybe see behind me, which is it definitely has, I would say, folkloric elements to it, kind of mythical tale about a magical tree thing. And I'm working on another book that I can't talk about, but it's also lovely to go back to Box of Delights because, as we've just been discussing, I think if you work at all in any area in fantasy, and folklore and magical storytelling. It's not the only seed, but it's an absolute vital seed of what's formed our imagination. So it's always a joy.
Thank you, Phil.
Well, just to say, this is now not just for Christmas, for all year round. Copies are available. Published. This is the latest edition, which is published by Hearn Books. Continue to work, of course, on Masefield. Never give up on trying to say read more Masefield. He wrote a vast amount, and there's a huge amount more out there that's not just Box of Delights. My current project is linked in with the Ledbury Town Council. They have are trying to promote Masefield in his hometown of Ledbury, and Masefield Matters, which is a project looking to work out the most appropriate way of memorializing him in the year of his 150th anniversary of his birth, which will be coming up in the next few years. So if anyone is interested in Masefield, please Google Masefield Matters or Ledbury Town Council, because it's a very worthwhile project running there in order to try and bring Masefield back from, well, more or less the oblivion in which he is. People know Midnight Folk and Box of Delights, but really that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Phil. On the episode page for this episode on the Folklore Podcast website, you will find convenient links to the things that have just been discussed so that you can go and find them easily for yourselves. You'll find links to the review of Phil's book, places where you can buy the things that have been discussed. Please go and do so and support the work of my fine guests today. Phil, Piers, Chris, thank you all for taking the time. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I hope that we will welcome you back either individually or as a group in the future to discuss more of this sort of thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
My thanks to Phil, to Piers, and to Chris. You can find links to all of their various online spaces via the Folklore Podcast website on the episode page for this episode of the show, and you'll also find the details in the show notes too. Don't forget that you can support the Folklore Podcast either by paying a small amount of money or by paying no money at all by joining our Patreon page at patreon.com/thefolklorepodcast. I'm going to be uploading some new bits and pieces on there for people supporting at all tiers, including, of course, the free tier in the next few days. So keep an eye on that. And if you don't already follow, go over there, subscribe as a free member, up your subscription later on if you want to a paid tier. It's entirely up to you. Any support is gratefully received, whether it's in financial terms or just by sharing episodes and telling your friends how much you enjoy the podcast. I'll be back very soon. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching if you watched on YouTube, and I'll see you next time.